My name's James and I paint minis. This is Spoon 37 Minis.
So today we're working on the Hive Tyrant Carapace with Abaddon Black from the Games Workshop. The idea is that we've already painted all of the red flesh on the model. Unfortunately, because of dry brushing and so on, there is some considerable overlap and a lot of it has spilt onto the hooves, carapace plates and so on, and now they need to be much more sharply defined because although I am going to paint the carapace in colours, the fundamental colour is black with some blue highlights, and so everything needs to be painted black that isn't going to be red. So here we are starting off with the hooves. Now you will notice I am being very careful. I am using quite a fine brush, the S Artificial Air brush, just to get into those sort of arches at the top of the hoof so I can get them black without ruining all of the flesh highlights that we've done in that area. So for a lot of it you can use big brush strokes, but just for those areas you just need to have a nice fine tip on the brush and just carefully work the paint into it without going over the edges, because if you go over the edges at this point you've just undone a lot of the work that you've done previously working on the red flesh highlights. Now, of course, I said earlier that the carapace was going to be fundamentally black with blue highlights. The hooves, of course, won't be blue at all. They're going to be predominantly grey, but I still want to have a nice sharp edge because in theory the darkest part of the hoof is still going to be black, and then we're going to build up dark greys and mid greys and light greys from there. So obviously the hooves and the spikes and so on are going to be grey. The carapace is going to be black with blue highlights. I'm sorry that you can't see quite what I'm doing. It's a function of the size of the base and me trying to get basically a brush horizontally along the base to do the bottom of the hoof. It can't really be helped unless I start having a camera that's sort of literally in front of my eyes kind of thing. So sorry about that, but I'm trying to show the model to the camera wherever possible. One thing to note when you're doing this is you really want to get the paint consistency just right. If it's too thick, it won't actually get into all of the nooks and crannies, and then if it's too thin, it won't actually cover up enough of the overspill that you're trying to paint over. And in fact, in some cases, I had it too thin on this, and it actually started to peel away visibly, almost like water on your kitchen worktop. It just kind of goes into a shape and peels away from the edges. So that was obviously far too runny. You probably can't see it too well on the camera, but I assure you there were times when I had to get more paint from the pot simply to make it actually stick to the model. Moving on to the lower leg carapace. This is actually a lot simpler than it probably looks. It is just a series of lines. The difficult bit is obviously it does also go over the edges very close to the skin that we've already painted. So just doing the underside and the back edges of these is actually a little bit involved, but it does pay dividends if you can actually paint over the edge but not touch the flesh. So you'll see me running the brush along it here to just catch the back edges of each plate, and that actually gives it a really sharp definition, because I don't think the highlights that we do later will actually touch that part of it, although they will touch the leading edges of each piece of carapace. I'm becoming conscious of trying to point the work to the camera. It's just a difficulty because I'm slightly off to one side of the camera and I don't want to be constantly bumping into the camera, so I am trying to face the workpiece to the camera so that you can see what's going on. Unfortunately, with the very base of the model, it is difficult to see every part of it. Having done the lower leg carapace, it's a case of doing these spikes, making sure there's plenty of paint on the brush before we start, and then each spike is comparatively simple. You've just got to remember that there are, because this is a three-dimensional shape, there's effectively four sides, left, right, top and bottom. And so I do the left side first, and then carry on and do the right side, and then the top, and then the bottom. Now, although this model is in sub-assemblies, I am still having to work at getting the brush in from all the right angles to paint all of the various parts. Obviously, if the tail section was already on, this would be much more difficult to do, which is why I'm painting it in sub-assemblies in the first place. But had you got the fully assembled model, you just have to go in from all kinds of weird angles just to get the paintbrush on the right part of the model. So, having had a quick tea break, we can carry on doing the carapace plates on the same leg, but now on the upper leg rather than the lower leg. These ones aren't actually too bad, but because this is primer with a matte finish, and I've found that the Abaddon Black that I'm currently using has a semi-gloss finish, I'm still going over every part of the carapace plates, so as to sharply define them with a colour that will actually show through in several places when the model is finished. As I hope you can see here, despite always being an advocate of two thin coats to get good colour, this is still giving us quite good coverage with just one coat, and the paint is not excessively thick by any stretch of the imagination, so it's still showing through a lot of details, and it's not getting into all of them and gumming them up and destroying all the detail that you've actually paid money for. Now, to finish these off, we have to do my favourite trick, which is painting over the edges, but not actually touching the previously painted surface, so the surface where it meets the leg, but not the leg itself. This is something that I do on all my models, and it really helps to give sharply defined edges and good contrast, but as you can see, you have to be incredibly slow and careful about it, which is one of the reasons why my videos tend to be so long, because I am self-confessed to be a slow painter. Now this bit is really tricky because I'm having to paint in between the legs to get the inside parts of the carapace on the same leg, and of course the other leg and the body to some degree is in the way. It does mean another bit of footage where it's not quite showing towards the camera, but it's close. You can see roughly where I'm putting the brush. I can do part of it from the front side and part of it from the back side. Now, unusually for me, I've decided to start carrying on from where I am, rather than going to the second leg and doing the hoof. So there's this sort of plate, looks a bit like a pelvis, except for the fact it's on the outside. And provided I don't go too far over the edges, I can just paint that black and you'll see it sharply defined compared to the surrounding area. Having to turn the miniature upside down here just to get the edge of this plate from the right angle. This is one of the more useful tricks of having the paint holder. It very readily turns upside down and shifts any which way without you losing control. Now I'm trying to avoid the two red sections in the middle because that's like a sort of inner section that on all my other Tyranids I've kept as kind of innards. The official paint scheme has them painted black with grey highlights, but I've never liked to do that. I keep them dark red. And so with that done, we can move on to the other leg, again starting with the hoof and carefully working paint into these arch sections. I'm hoping you can see how much this is adding to the definition of the edge between the sort of top of the hoof and the skin surrounding it, because obviously it starts off just kind of with this weird fade into darker red, and then once I've painted it, there's a sharp black edge to it. Unfortunately, the back of the hoof is just painting straight across, but you can't actually see it because of the lip of the base. It's not particularly complicated, and I hope you can see it afterwards once I start painting other sections of the leg. but obviously the involved part is the hoof with the arches at the top, and then doing the carapace plates as I'm starting now. Now obviously as I go through these, some are closer to just black primer than others. Some, like the section I've just painted, were very, very red due to dry brushing. And so doing this evens out that tone, makes them all completely black all over, meaning that you have good contrast before you move on to any further painting steps. Hoping this angle shows the back of the plates, just where it goes around the edge, because it can be difficult to get to those areas just to paint where they roll over towards the skin, but not actually painting the skin. Decided that's good enough for the lower leg plates. Moving on to the spikes on the back of the leg, sort of in the calf area. Although this thing has multi-jointed legs, so calf is a questionable description. But again, painting the one side, then the other, then the top, then the bottom, just to make sure you've got black paint all over before moving on to, I believe these parts will be grey later on. So you'll be moving on to dark grey, medium grey, light grey. Perhaps a lot easier to see than the lower parts of the leg is the carapace on the upper leg, which is very large and actually in places isn't that bad, but as I said before, because of the slightly different finish of this paint compared to the primer, I'm going to go over every inch of every leg plate just to be absolutely sure that it has this nice even colour with, as I said, it's a kind of semi-gloss finish from Abaddon Black compared to the matte primer. The upper surfaces are quick and easy. The bit that takes time is the edges, which, as you can see, just really takes a steady hand and the right angle, and all of this is done with the same brush, so there's no need to use constantly smaller and smaller tip brushes. I mean, there is a sense when you're starting out when you think, oh no, my brush is too big, I need a finer brush, and you do see brushes that have very small or very fine tips, actually you're probably better learning to use the brush that you have, unless it is excessively large. Because I mean, as I say, I'm doing all of this with this Artificia S layer brush, and for some bits I could actually be using a much bigger brush. It's just it would have to be a bigger brush that can produce a fine tip, which tends to be what you get when you pay a lot of money for a brush. So having done the legs, we can move on to this weird little bit of carapace in the sort of abdomen region. It's a bit like seeing the spine, except for the fact it's on the outside, front and back. And it's just a series of tiny little plates, which again, if they aren't sharply defined, the model won't actually look like it has very much contrast, so I have to go over these very carefully. It's not so bad at the front, but at the sides it sort of curls around very quickly, and you've got to be very careful not to get it on the red parts. I don't know how well you'll be able to see these, but there are actually some little plates at the back as well, just above where the tail glues on. So hopefully, yeah, there you go. You can actually see them now. There's not much area to paint, but it's just important to get them done. Moving on, we have these strange plates off to the side, and I'm calling them strange because there's been several iterations of this model. I think they're currently up to the 3rd iteration, this being the 1st, and only this one has these 2 plates either side of the head, and so I'm not entirely sure what colour to paint them, because they should probably be different to the carapace. I might try painting them grey like the hooves, and that way there's blue and black carapace next to sort of black and grey bony plates either side of the head. But either way, I've got to paint them black at this stage because they are, as you can see, in some places discoloured quite heavily. And just like with the plates lower down, you have to paint not only the front face but also all the way around the edges. Now, of course, because these plates actually stick out so much, there is also the back of them to paint, certainly where it sticks out both sides above the main carapace, which I haven't got to yet, but I want to do these first all the way around just to make sure that I haven't forgotten to do anything like the underside or the little inside part here, and then I can move on to the actual main carapace here, where I'm just starting above the head. There's a kind of hood over the head that comes to a point, but then there's also the sort of fleshy area inside that you don't want to paint over. Moving on to the main carapace, a lot of this should be fairly quick and easy simply because it's just a big area, but then some areas like the edges you have to be a bit more careful of, because obviously I don't want to do the classic mistake of just getting stuff on the red areas that are currently flesh. And of course this edge is ill-defined, which is why I hesitated a moment ago, because I wasn't sure to paint just the very edge, or there's a sort of triangle that goes inwards between the arm socket and the rib cage, and that could also be painted black. It's just not very well defined, so I've decided to omit it for the time being. I can always go back to it later if I need to. If you ever come across an area like this that isn't super well defined, the trick is really to be consistent, to have a line of even thickness, and that way it looks like you meant to paint it that way. Whereas if you have a line that varies in thickness along the model, and the model doesn't really cooperate in the sense of having that sharply defined detail, it will look like, well, you didn't know what you're doing kind of thing. Think I'm going out of my way to paint the bottom of the carapace. I'm actually trying to trace the carapace all the way around the edges and then do the middle, and what you'll find is I'll gradually have done all of the area at the base of the chimneys, so then I can paint each of the chimneys and this sort of very finely detailed spine down the centre. Speaking of chimneys, just starting to paint the area around the base of the chimneys on the left hand side. I call these chimneys because on the more recent models they are actually hollowed out to look like chimneys or smokestacks or something like that. Obviously they just sort of stand upright and don't have any kind of hole or exhaust at the top on this older model, but everyone calls them chimneys, so I'm calling them chimneys. Now, because these parts of the model stick out so much, it's actually a lot easier than some of the earlier sections. There is a lot of surface area to go over, but because they stick out, I can use large brush strokes, plenty of paint on the brush, just trying to make sure it doesn't pool up too much, because there are small details, there are like scratches and battle damage actually moulded into these, but as long as you cover every part of it with paint that isn't excessively thick, it should be absolutely fine. Having done the first chimney in line, I'm moving on to the second one going down the back, and then once I've done the second and third, I'll go on to the other side. This just makes sure that I do every part of each chimney in order and don't actually miss out anything by confusing the order as to what I've done and what I haven't done. This is particularly important when painting the same colour, so black over black, because otherwise it can be difficult to keep track of what you've actually painted and what you haven't. It's one of the things you may notice in my videos. I will always tend to do things in a certain order that I can repeat over and over, rather than just paint whatever takes my fancy at the time and then be confused partway through painting as to what I've already painted and what I haven't. Moving on to the third chimney, the one at the base of the back carapace, the last one in the line. And at this point, of course, they are converging, they're getting closer together and they're getting closer to the central sort of spine area. So this gets more difficult to paint, so you just have to be careful. Obviously the outer edges and the top are easy, but then the inside edge gets a bit more difficult to paint the inside of. Same pattern again with doing the other side, making sure that there's paint on the base of each chimney, because of course I've been around the edges but I don't quite know where I stopped, so just to be sure I'm going around all of those edges. It's worth noting actually technically the second and third chimneys, the ones that are sort of pointing outwards rather than up, are actually a singular piece on each side, whereas the big one at the top is molded into the base model's torso, and so there's actually less of a gap between the second and third ones than there is between the first one and the second one. It's around this time I started to wish I was using a slightly larger brush, going back to what I said earlier about as a beginner you can often want a smaller and smaller and smaller brush, fearing that you can't get it into the tightest spaces or paint the finest details, but actually for most of this brush has been perfectly fine, but these areas are so big that I can hardly get enough paint on the brush to actually paint, say, the side of a chimney without loading up the brush, 2, 3, 4 times. So having done all of the chimneys, inside, out, top, all of the details, we can now start on this central spine, or at least that's what I'm calling it. It's a row of overlapping plates running down the centre. I think they took the idea of an exoskeleton quite literally when they were making this sculpt originally. So this is, if you will, the spine, and then as you can see I'm fully painting one side with a motion going up across each spine. The idea is to get it into the join. It gets more difficult as I go along, and I hope you can see what I'm doing, because where those two bottom chimneys meet, it's actually really difficult to get the brush in. It becomes progressively more difficult because it's very open at the top, and then it narrows and narrows and narrows as you go down, but the actual shape of that spine in the center stays the same. You may notice, compared to my normal painting, I'm not being super precise with this step. I am letting the bristles splay out a little bit, getting plenty of paint on the brush. This is simply so that it gets into and runs into all of the details. And that should finish it off. So I'm going to show you a couple of stills, how it started off, and as you can see there's lots of red all over the black sections. It's quite ill defined in some places as to what's black and what's red. And then I've got a shot of the model admittedly turned around slightly from after it's finished, and here we go. It is much more defined, much more obvious what's black and what's red. That was the whole point of doing this.
Right, if you watched this far, first of all, thank you for watching. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you can get notifications about future videos. I hope they will be coming out soon.